Hello, everybody, and welcome to Asynchronous Time. So I just want to start off this video acknowledging that last night's reading was hefty. There was a ton of information in that reading, a ton of good information, and I don't want it to just kind of like ease out of our minds just because we're moving on. So I do want to create a video, or I did want to create a video, kind of explaining all of that content you learned in last night's reading, because it's really fundamental to know this information when learning U.S. history, not just during the Revolutionary period, but also just throughout every time period that we'll touch on. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. Okay, so the American Revolution unintentionally led to the birth of new revolutionary ideals. Conversations about the rights of all men came up almost immediately after the passing of the Declaration of Independence. Even yesterday when we were watching that oversimplified video, a lot of us were kind of calling out the hypocrisy of Thomas Jefferson writing about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, independence, freedom, while owning a whole plantation full of slaves. People also started to question what equality really meant. Abolitionist movements rose. Abolitionist societies rose. You saw more events filled with abolitionists, people really wanting to protest for the freedom of all Black people. Though some, I will say, were pushing for abolition, that didn't necessarily mean they thought that Black people should have equal rights. They just understood that it was very inhumane to keep people enslaved, especially based off race. The gradual emancipation law passed in Pennsylvania, which basically said that all children of slaves would then be free. This essentially gradually emancipating all slaves within Pennsylvania, and that spilled over into other free states. Once 1800 came, most states in the North were completely free. There was no slavery. These ideals also spilled over into topics about gender roles and the rights of women. Women had taken up such a huge role in society during that Revolutionary War that it became apparent how fundamental women are to American society and making sure that it functions correctly. There was also this widespread belief at the time that it was the duty of the mother to instill Republican values in her children. Notice in these photos how you see women kind of in close contact with their children. In most imagery during this time period, especially in America, you saw a lot of women either holding the hand of their child or reading books to their child or having their children sitting on their laps or being surrounded by children while in a home creating gear for their husbands who were soldiers. So this was a huge ideal during this time period. Though women still did not have the right to work in office, you never saw a woman in a higher up political position. This was their political role during the American Revolution, to instill these values into their children, more specifically their sons. The American Revolution also inspired revolutions in various other nations. They inspired the French Revolution, where the French ended up beheading their king and getting rid of him and establishing a new form of government. That did slightly look different in the Americas because the U.S. didn't need to behead their king. They just wanted freedom from King George of England. It also inspired the Haitian Revolution, which did look very different than the American Revolution in that the Haitian Revolution was the first revolution of slaves who successfully received their freedom from the French. And then lastly, they inspired the Brazilian Revolution. The only difference was that they were revolting against the King of Spain. Portugal. During this time period, states also created their own form of government. So as you can see in this image, we have a map of the United States in 1775. You can see how we were only 13 states at this time. Each of those states had their own government. So when they were trading with different countries, it was that state in particular that had foreign affairs with the other country. This made it very difficult for the national government because the national government did not really have much of a say in how the whole country functions. There was way too many smaller state governments going on. That was actually largely due to the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation established no court system. It had no power to enforce treaties. They couldn't enforce laws on a national scale. Again, they could not collect taxes. It made it very difficult for the national government to function as a national government because there were so many different state governments. This was created due to this fear of not wanting to have another monarchy. So when they created the Articles of Confederation, they wanted to make sure that the national government didn't have so much power that they ended up becoming just like the King of Britain or any other king in Europe. Many politicians believe that the only way to get around that was to give all of the powers to the states. Again, this was unsuccessful because the national government really couldn't function as like one whole collective of states. There was way too many various state governments going on. So this document ended up failing and it needed to be recreated, which is why we now have the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution gave the national government power to collect taxes, to have a national army, to regulate trade, to engage in foreign affairs, and to really function as one whole country. Many powers still remained with the states, and this created this whole ideal of federalism where there's a split between how much power the state governments have and how much power the federal government has, which is why the federal government is called federal government due to federalism. And actually, I want to go back to this. To make federalism make sense, think about what's happening with COVID right now, right? Where the national government, the federal government, they might be saying one thing, that we need to reopen states, that students need to go back to school, that we need to do all these things to come back to a functioning society. But there are state governments that are arguing something that is completely different. So you see that conflict between state governments and federal governments, and how though the federal government can create laws that impact all of the nation, state governments are able to interpret those laws themselves or kind of push back when it comes to laws coming from the national government. Okay, so the U.S. Constitution also introduced this idea of separation of powers, meaning certain powers were allocated to the legislative branch, which is the branch of government that creates laws. This is where Congress and the Senate is at. They also allocated rights to the judicial branch, which is where the Supreme Court is at. And then there were specific rights for the executive government, where the president and his cabinet sits. The U.S. Constitution also created the system of checks and balances, which basically said that any branch of government can check the action of another. So if the judicial branch does not like a law that the legislative branch has passed or thinks that it's inhumane or unjust, they can knock that down. Same with the executive branch. If they're not fond of what the judicial branch is doing, they can kind of have a say in that and so forth. So they're able to check each other. There was also huge debates going on in the U.S. about representation in government, more specifically like how states were represented in government. Many small states wanted there to be an equal representation of all states in government, meaning they wanted there to be the same amount of congressmen in each state, the same amount of senators, etc. Whereas larger states thought that it should be based off of population. Think of Texas, right? Even though Texas wasn't a part of the nation at this moment. But think of Texas. Texas is a huge state. Texas would have way more people in government than Rhode Island would due to population size. So larger states wanted more representation in government due to the fact that they took up more space and had more people. So there were two really big compromises that came about because of these debates. One was the Great Compromise, which basically said that every state has 2 senators. And then when it comes to the House of Representatives or Congress, that's based off population. So that was a huge compromise between the large states and small states. There was another compromise called the 3/5 Compromise, which basically said that for every 5 black men, they count for just 3 white men. So for black slaves, just slaves in general, every 5 black slaves counts as 3 white men. And this was huge because larger states, again, wanted more representation in government. So they wanted to be able to count their slave populations as well, because most of the larger states were more in the South, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, etc. Smaller states, of course, did not want this because they wanted more of an equal representation of all states in government. And it wasn't that the slave states that wanted to count their slaves valued their slaves, wanted them to have rights. They literally did this because they wanted a larger population count, so that when only those white men were voting, they were able to vote to keep slavery still alive. Lastly, we're going to move on to Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, and this might be one of the most important concepts that we really want to grasp from last night's reading. This is the first time we see a large split between Federalist ideals, so how much power the states and the federal government should have, specifically how much power the national government should have. Sorry, y'all, I'm getting really tongue-tied, but I'm almost done. Federalists, of course, were in support of federalism, so just think Federalists like federalism. Federalists thought that national government should have a decent amount of power. They should be able to collect taxes, to have a national army, to be the one to engage in foreign affairs, to be able to regulate trade. They thought that those powers were specifically for the federal government. However, anti-federalists were against that. They were again scared that that would create a tyrannical government, a government that would turn into the monarchy, basically. So, as a compromise between both groups, they added the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights is just the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, which basically specifies individual rights that all Americans have that the federal government can't supersede. They can't break those rights. The 10th Amendment gave certain powers specifically to the state governments. 10th Amendment basically says that anything that's not stated in this Bill of Rights, that's not stated in the U.S. Constitution, the states can then go ahead and determine themselves. So this was a very huge compromise itself, and it's also when we first start to see kind of like difference in political views arise, and ultimately where we start to see political parties being born. Lastly, I just want to add that, of course, the Federalists supported the U.S. Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were more in favor of the Articles of Confederation. So think states' rights, Anti-Federalists. National government having most of the rights, Federalists. I hope this video helped the reading or made the reading make more sense. If it didn't, just message me on Teams. I know sometimes we just need to hear someone say it, or we need to see visuals, so I hope this did that for you. If you like this, I can do this more, especially when we have more hefty readings. But I really wanted to make sure that y'all grasp this concept from this lesson.